Welcome to the Data-Driven Understanding of Meditation and Consciousness webinar. Today we have Dr. Barry Cohen to tell us more about mental pain, boredom, and diffuse nociception. And Dr. Cohen is an adjunct faculty of the NYU Applied Psychology program, and he co-directs the Mindful Education Lab at NYU along with Joshua Aronson. He recently retired as a clinical associate professor and had been the director of NYU's master program in psychology for more than a decade. And so he has taught statistics and research design for more than 25 years, and is the author of multiple statistic books, textbooks. He currently working on some research area on the subjective and neurocorrelates of inner speech and the cognitive, affective, and physiological changes produced by the regular practices of meditation and related mental exercises. But more personally, Barry actually wanted to be an astrophysicist as a child when he was 12 years old. And this led him to major in physics at Stony Brook University. But when he was a junior, a young professor of nuclear physics had intrigued him with informal talk on transcendental meditation and how much it had affected his mental state. So Barry was soon instructed in the technique of transcendental meditation and began meditating twice a day and every day, and still does after 55 years. And after completing his bachelor's degree in physics, he transitioned to psychology, and that usually happens in science, transition from physics to psychology, and by getting a master's degree at Queens College. And that prepared him to enter NYU's PhD program in experimental psychology. And one of his doctoral committee members was Richie Davison, a professor at a small college nearby, who became his postdoctoral sponsor. After which Richie moved to the University of Wisconsin. So not surprisingly, Barry became very interested in the neuromechanism underlying meditative states and the process of meditation. And because transcendental meditation is a mantra-based form of meditation, Barry's interest turned towards an understanding of inner speech and the motor mechanism it shares with overt speech. After teaching others informally how to meditate, Barry became acutely aware of the major obstacles confronted by the new meditators. So the vague, unpleasant feeling known as boredom. And his reading of recent psychological and neuroscience-based research on boredom and the related topics of mind wandering, introception, mental pain, and both the default mode and salience network of the brain led him to write a theoretical article connecting these concepts. So his article, which is now in press in a new APA journal, Psychology of Consciousness, is entitled Boredom, Mental Pain, and Diffuse Nociception. That is the topic of his talk today. Let's welcome Barry to tell us more about pain and boredom.
Yeah, I hope that you're not going to learn about boredom from my boring talk, but I don't want to induce any mental pain in people. So thank you very much, Mungson. I have to say, a great joy of my life lately is collaborating with Mungson and Sai and Angqi and the rest of the lab. What a great team. So anyway, I'm going to start with a little outline. I'm just going to assume, this is consciousness is an important topic of these webinars, but I'm just going to assume that there's kind of a one-to-one relationship between subjective experience and a brain activity pattern. I'm not going to question that. Then I'm going to separate the sensory from the affective component of pain, and then look at the brain activity associated with the aversive aspect of pain. And then I have a little speculation about pain as a narrowing of consciousness, whereas a feeling of meaningfulness is based on an expansion of consciousness. And then I decided I would put in an intermission for like clarification questions, so I don't have to go all the way to the end before I can take some questions. And then I talk about the cause of the mental pain of boredom. and in terms of diffuse nociception, which I'll explain, of course. And then this all leads to understanding mind wandering and our addiction to the default mode network. And finally, I'll talk about the role of attitudes in heightening or decreasing mental pain. Now, there's going to be a lot to unpack and process in this talk. I've stuffed a lot of stuff in. So be aware that this is being recorded, and therefore you can watch it again at your leisure and start and stop it in order to, you know, more process what I'm going to be doing right now rather quickly. And there's a companion article. I opted for open access on my Psych of Consciousness article. So if you're wondering, where's all the references? Where's all the scientific background for these wild claims that I will be making? It's in the article, a lot of references, a lot of neuroscience studies supporting what I'm saying. Okay, let me get past that. So, well, it is a painful topic here. And so the big question here is whether when we say that, you know, this musical performance was painful, you know, because they were not good, or this, you know, something was, a talk was boring, we talk about it being painful. Is that a metaphor, or is there real pain involved in these, when we say that it's painful like that? So it's important to notice that physical pain has very distinct components, a sensory discriminative and an affective motivational component. And they can be rated separately. And so there's been a number of experiments where people will rate the intensity of the sensory aspect of the pain separately from its affective quality, its aversive quality. And so we found a number of variables, psychological variables that affect that. So if the pain is really controllable and predictable, you're going to have less aversiveness relative to the sensory intensity, where you'll have the opposite if it's, you know, the pain is not controllable or predictable and seems to be a threat. Now, the thing is, there's no question that we can have the sensory component of pain without an affective component. And that's why I prefer to refer to nociception rather than pain, as I'll talk about that. Nociception is sort of the sensory system that brings what we'd call pain signals towards the brain. But whether we really have pain from the nociception or how much pain we have, that's very much affected by psychology. So for instance, I myself experienced this dissociation with what they call laughing gas, nitrous oxide. I was at a dentist, and they were doing the Novocaine injection, and I was on the nitrous oxide. And very interestingly, I could feel the needle going into my flesh, but it sort of wasn't my flesh. I was just sort of observing it, and it didn't bother me, and it wasn't really painful to me, which tells you that's one example where you can have the sensory component without the aversiveness at all. And then there are people who have this congenital indifference to pain, or pain asymbolia, where, I mean, that doesn't bother them. And so they wind up sometimes injuring themselves because, and then like someone who had this broken ankle and then kept walking on it and really ruined, you know, their bones and all that because they didn't really affect them. And then there's neurosurgery. You know, in the old days, they did lobotomies for, you know, really bad, well, they did it for a number of reasons: schizophrenia, terrible depression, or unrelenting pain. And they've refined it. Now we don't do lobotomies anymore for these things. But there is something called a cingulotomy, where they kind of interrupt the projection of the cingulate cortex to the prefrontal cortex. And that really helps reduce the aversive aspect of pain. So it really helps us to localize where that aversiveness comes in, and shows you that you can have the sensory aspect of pain without the aversiveness. In fact, I wouldn't even call it pain if you don't have the aversive aspect. Then you just have a sensation. There was a woman in Scotland who had this asymbolia, and she said when she gave birth, people told her, well, you're probably going to need pain medication. But she just said, well, I felt some strange feelings, some stretching, some kind of, you know, but it didn't bother me. Anyway, you can separate it. So the big question is, though, can you have the affective component of physical pain in the absence of the sensory component? Can it go the other way? And we know that people with severe depression, they always describe this as pain, and pain that's worse than any physical pain that they've ever felt. Like there's been some descriptions where the guy said, you know, he woke up in the middle of the night, didn't realize that there had been some changes in the position of furniture. It was dark. He tripped over a table, broke both his legs. He said, that pain, nothing compared to the pain of my depression. And they call it, it's definitely called pain. So we call it mental pain. And there's a lot of comorbidity, correlation between having chronic pain and depression. In which case it seems like, you know, the brain activity that is responsible for the affective component of pain is just stuck. So what are we talking about in terms of the brain activity here? Well, neural signals from sensory receptors, I'm going to sometimes just read this. Neural signals from sensory receptors like touch receptors in the skin travel to specific nuclei in the thalamus, and which projects these signals to a primary receptive area in the neocortex, like somatosensory. Now we're talking about ordinary sensory stuff. But then there are nociceptors in, you know, the skin, in the viscera, and even in muscles. And these impulses travel in a more central way into integrative thalamic nuclei, which are projected to the insular cortex, which is the primary reception area for interoception. So for instance, in terms of vision, the thalamus projects to the primary visual area, and that's the initial area where all the visual information goes, and then it goes to secondary and tertiary areas. Well, in the case of interoception, signals coming from within the body, they go to the insular cortex. That's their primary place to go for processing. And then the insular cortex projects to the amygdala, which can get us excited about, you know, the threat, and also to the cingulate cortex. Oh yeah, so one thing I'll avoid is the whole consciousness debate about, you know, can you feel it if it's just in your insular cortex? Can you have a visual experience if it's only in your primary visual area that's activated, or does it require, you know, according to some consciousness theories, activation of the prefrontal cortex or some more elaborate activation? I'm going to pretty much avoid that. Although in the pain, in the case of pain, the affective pain, that's where I think you really do need prefrontal cortex activation. So just a little bit about, you know, the pathway here. And interrupting the pathway with the cingulotomy really helps. So it looks like a very important part of creating the unpleasant part of pain is the insular cortex projecting to the anterior cingulate cortex, which projects to the medial prefrontal cortex, and that it's really where the medial prefrontal cortex that drives this pain reaction, according to me. A lot of speculation going on here. So for instance, very interesting about, can you have just a pure mental pain that has nothing to do with any bodily signals? And so they did an experiment where they had people who had experienced a recent, you know, breakup that was painful for them. And they had two conditions for each person that had two different conditions. One where they were reminded that they had a photo, you know, they'd given them a photo of their person that broke up with them. And they would show that photo as compared to, you know, neutral photos. And then they had a physical pain condition where they heat up your skin. They have this thermal thing that causes some pain. And look to see brain scanning wise, how different is this? You know, is it really causing regular pain? Is social rejection causing the same kind of pain as the heating of your, leg. And so because of this audience, I wanted to mention that in one article, here, a recent article, they addressed the whole idea of whether this social rejection pain is really the same as physical pain. And so they looked at the patterns of fMRI activity within these relevant areas. And they used multivoxel pattern similarity analysis to look at correlations in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and different parts of the insula. And they calculated these weights using SVM, support vector machine weights for physical pain and romantic rejection, and they were able to discriminate on a kind of a micro level. And that said to them, well, this is not exactly the same as regular pain, but one thing is that you can note is that pretty much anything that reduces physical pain also reduces mental pain. So in one experiment where they simulate social rejection, with this computer game kind of thing, and they make it look like you're cut out of the game, and that bothers people sometimes. But if you gave them acetaminophen, Tylenol, that would reduce the pain of their social rejection, which is kind of interesting that, that something like that would actually affect your social pain. But there's a lot of overlap, and various drive states activate the same pain circuit, which overlaps with what is called a salience network. There's basically pain is salient. You have to pay attention to it. And so it's a big overlap there. So I'm going to use the spotlight model of attention. It's not really so much a theory as just a description. And so here's where I get into some really wild speculation that the whole point of pain, the pain is not about the activation of one specific neuron or one pattern of neurons or anything like that. It really has to do with a kind of a mobilization of the brain. And it sort of goes into emergency mode. But anyway, this is the basic spotlight model, is that we have a focus area where the spotlight is. That's conscious awareness. We can report on what's in there. We're aware of that, verbally and all that right there. And then there's the preconscious, which is a fringe around it, which can enter the conscious. It's, but it's just a question of shifting the focus around in this area. And so it depends on, what's salient or what's interesting at that moment. What about the preconscious is like, we've all had the experience where we're sitting somewhere and suddenly a motor or an air conditioner or something shuts off. And then we realize, oh, that thing has been on all the time, but I didn't really hear it because it entered your preconscious. It was steady noise. It was nothing interesting. So it was in your preconscious, but it was could easily become conscious if someone pointed it out to you. And of course, when it shuts off, you notice that. And then I would say there's this margin, and then this white area is the unconscious. This might consist of various like visceral things that you're not, directly conscious of, and can't be anyway. So speculation alert. So my theory of how we get this aversive subjective experience of pain is that when you have strong nociception, strong signals coming from the body that suggest there's a threat to your bodily integrity, this all goes to the medial prefrontal cortex, which then sends the brain into this emergency problem-solving mode. It narrows the focus of attention. It musters all your mental resources to solve the pain problem. You have to focus on it and figure it out. Of course, it's not really solvable, but that's sort of part of the curse of having a big brain and having all these cognitive abilities and problem solving, because sometimes it's not relevant, but we still mobilize it. And that takes a lot of energy. So I'm saying here that the marshaling of mental resources, which reduces external sensory processing. Remember, we're focusing down. It consumes a great deal of metabolic energy. So it's adaptive that it be, you gotta tell people I'm, I'm president of my condo board. So anyway, so so it's adaptive that mental effort and this kind of mental effort be aversive, because it's using up a lot of resources, and so it makes sense that it should be painful. We should not be doing this lightly, but we do often anyway. So expanding the attentional spotlight is what can reduce suffering. So here's where I continue to speculation, like psychedelic drugs. And I did, work on psilocybin. They expand consciousness. They expand that spotlight of attention. They activate a wide range of brain areas, and this can be seen in brain scanning that you see, well, activation all over the brain. And what's going on is deeper and broader processing of all your sensory experience. And this automatically reduces the focus on nociceptive stimuli. That gets diminished, it gets washed out from all this other processing. And there indeed can be neural downregulation of pain centers. But anyway, meditation, of course, has the same kind of goal. So the idea is that if we really observe the sensory sensations and really focus on that, the sensory aspect rather than the aversive aspect, that reduces the aversive aspect. And so that's what I call it, Buddhism 101. This is an attitude of non-judgmental acceptance of these nociceptive stimuli. And that reduces the threatening aspect. And it reduces the emergency narrowing of attention. So sensory rejection, it's really sensory rejection versus sensory intake. Sensory rejection is what causes suffering. Remember, there's dukkha, which is bad things happening. That's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is that it generally causes suffering. The third noble truth is that it doesn't have to cause suffering. And the fourth noble truth is how to do that, how to separate the aversiveness. So just, I'm going to throw in a minor question right now, such as, what is the meaning of life? And people often do want a feeling of meaningfulness and consider that very important. And part of boredom is not feeling a sense of meaningfulness. So here's my hypothesis, which is the reverse of the narrowing of consciousness, that the breadth and depth of processing sensory stimuli, internal and external, that's what gives you a sense of meaning. Meaning is all about associations and connections. So what does this evoke for you? The more associations a stimulus evokes for you and more processing, the more meaningful it seems to be. That's where meaning comes from, is connections and associations. If you look in a dictionary for the meaning of a word, it'll just give you a bunch of other words that are connected to it. That's the meaning of the word. And so anyway, so this is the opposite of this narrowing of consciousness, this expanding, which gives you the sense of meaningfulness. Okay, any questions? I thought I should, probably take a quick break just to be sure, because I'm throwing a lot of stuff at people. Let's see. Yeah, people have probably is too much to be able to ask a question. It's like, I don't know what to ask. Okay. But do, raise your hand or whatever it is that you do in Zoom to indicate if you have a question, put it in the chat, etc. There'll be some time at the thing is, I don't have to rush away exactly at 1 o'clock. So if some people want to hang out a little bit, but anyway.
Yeah, they can also post in the Q&A tab.
Oh yeah, Q&A.
Questions.
Yeah. Okay. So
my question, Barry, was you posted some of these thoughts as speculation, and Um, they
Well,
seem reasonable.
some is
Huh?
more speculative than others, but there's
Uh-huh.
a lot of it is speculation. But yeah.
Okay. So what aspects of those are you going to connect in the subsequent part of the talk?
Um, well, some will connect more than others.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually am not sure. I mean, I'm going to find out along with you and everyone else as we go through the talk. And then at the end, we can see what were their loose ends. There was
Mm-hmm.
some things not connected. I can't even be sure, if I've connected everything.
Mm-hmm.
So the paper that I wrote does a better job of connecting.
Mm-hmm.
This here, I'm sort of highlighting uh,
Mm-hmm.
parts of the paper, especially that I thought would be relevant to consciousness and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So to continue then, and jump in at any point with a question, Si. As I mentioned earlier, um, various drive states can activate the salience network, like hunger, thirst, whatever, and it produces mild mental pain. So, I mean, hunger, I mean, it could become extreme, but I'm talking for the average, person in the United States. The average person, you get some hunger and there's some mild mental pain about it. Um, Negative emotions are associated with mental pain. So like daily life, there's always plenty of temporary annoyances, frustrations, disappointments, even some social rejections. And all of these cause a little mini burst of mental pain. Um, but the feeling of boredom I found particularly interesting as a special case of relatively mild mental pain. And it's really kind of pure mental pain. I'm not I'm excluding existential boredom. When I say that the feeling of boredom is relatively mild, I'm excluding the existential boredom where people feel life is totally meaningless and then they're, feeling horrible about it. Um, but the thing is, boredom, there's no obvious physiological reason for boredom to cause pain. There's a reason for hunger to cause pain. There's a reason why hunger would create salience. You need to do something about it. Boredom, is that an emergency? Is that a big threat to you that you're bored? You have to do something? Where is this pain coming from? Um, from a lack of stimulation? Um, so my point is really that there's a baseline state of essentially the possibility of mental pain that emerges. It's, in other words, the mental pain of boredom isn't suddenly created by the fact that you're sitting there doing nothing. Um, it was in the background. It was in the pre-conscious all the time. And it's when you have no distractions, it can easily move into the focus of your attention. And that's where it produces some mild feeling of mental pain. So it's out there ready to get you at any time if you don't keep distracting yourself. And we know how easily we're addicted to distractions. So um, So in fact, there's one experiment got incredible amount.
Barry?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I had kind of a general question. Like you were talking about this means of distraction. I mean, if it's something that you would normally do that is kind of associated more with positive emotion, then we wouldn't call it a distraction, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like, for instance, let's say you go to an art museum, and enjoying the beautiful art and stuff. To call that a distraction seems like to diminish the cultural experience. So the thing is, though, a point I'm going to make later is that anything that's pleasurable can work both ways. So let's say eating. Eating is very normal. You have to do it. But for some people, they focus on comfort food and they overeat, and it's called stress eating. And so the eating can serve more than one purpose. It can serve a biological purpose, but it can also serve as a distraction. And so we can pervert almost any, normal activity into something that's becomes obsessive and, uh, and and can actually have negative aspects. But yes, otherwise it sounds like all of life is a distraction, and um, And I don't mean to diminish the fact, and it's a good point. It's really good to point out that that a lot of these positive things are just normal positive things, and you don't need them to be a distraction. But I was going to mention that this study became rather famous for the fact that when people had to sit in a room for 15 minutes without distractions, well, they were hooked up with electric shocks from before the period of boredom, and it was set to a point where I don't want that shock. And yet when they were in the boredom situation, they gave themselves some shocks. Not everyone, but it was surprising that anyone gave themselves shocks. But my theory there goes back to controllable pain versus uncontrollable pain. What's less clear is that the mental pain of boredom is not easy to control, and that makes it somewhat aversive. It's like, you can't control it if you're deprived of distractions in that experiment. But controllable pain, like giving yourself a shock, is less aversive, and sort of explains why some people, really serious, mentally pained people, will engage in cutting, what's called non-suicidal self-injury. Again, it has to do with like, I have this mental pain. I can't put my finger on it. I don't know how to deal with it. I'd rather have concrete physical pain. It's preferable. And that's a really desperate move, but it makes sense to me anyway. So the thing is, I mean, is there a drive state? Is that the problem? I mean, there is the exploratory drive, and we could say that that's a real drive, and that if you're blocking the exploratory drive, that might cause some salience, might cause some kind of mental pain. But that doesn't seem to account for the huge differences, individual differences in boredom proneness and all that. Why some people just have much more exploratory drive than others, and that's why they get bored so much more easily. Well, the fact is there's a high correlation between boredom proneness and neuroticism, and various states of like anxiety and depression and all that. So big differences, which is what I just explained. So I don't think it can be explained by differences in the exploratory drive or any particular drive. What I think is that well, of course, this is just explaining the nociceptive system, and I want to make it clear that nociception is not the same as pain. It's important to distinguish it because there's so many factors that affect for a given intensity of nociception, right? So you create a certain amount of thermal heat on the skin in the laboratory, and that's a certain concrete amount of neural stimulation coming from skin receptors. How much pain is that going to cause? It has a lot to do in terms of pain. I mean, the aversive part. When I talk about pain, I'm really talking about the aversive part of pain. And how much will that, skin stimulation produce pain? Well, it depends on a lot of things. Depends on whether you're controlling that heat, whether you have a placebo. They'll, put some cream on your skin and say, well, this will protect you from, from pain, and it does help for people. Or if you create an attitude of acceptance of that feeling. Actually, I was at a conference, and one guy said, he was doing this kind of thing and had people, have this accepting attitude. They had to watch out because some people their skin would get burned before they would actually complain about it. They were in such an acceptance mode, So anyway, so high level of anxiety can actually amplify the suffering aspect of pain beyond what the signal is. There's even something called allodynia where, even mild touch can cause pain. If your circuits are off like that. And then inflammation has its effect. But if it's controllable and predictable, okay. So my concept, diffuse nociception, is basically just that you're getting nociceptive signals from nociceptors all around the body and stuff, but none of these signals is strong enough by itself to produce a localized sensation of pain that gets your attention. So it's just more of a malaise, a vague feeling of discomfort that you can get from this. And it can be caused by chronic low-level inflammation. The thing is, when we react with stress, stress hormones get released and all that, adrenaline, all that. This has lasting effects on our system. And if you have this like chronic stress, where it's long-term stress and stuff, this actually affects the whole stress system. And ironically, too much cortisol floating around will actually damage the mechanisms that reduce cortisol. So you wind up stuck. And then there's, heightened levels of muscle tension. Thing about muscle tension, that's where progressive relaxation can help. You can have, muscle tension is essentially a voluntary thing. You can relax muscle tension, but only if you're aware of it. What happens is a lot of this muscle tension goes into the preconscious. We don't really, not so aware of it. We have a general feeling of tension, but we're not aware of, that we're tensing up particular muscles, which we often do as a way of, again, having a control over pain. Like if someone's about to give you an injection and it's going to hurt a little bit, you tense up. And why do you tense up? Well, part of the reason you tense up is to distract yourself. You'd rather feel the pain of your own tension, which you can control, than that shot, which you cannot control when the needle goes into you. So there's visceral discomfort. There's a number of things that can cause these vague levels of comfort, and they all come out. So I'm proposing that for most people, DN, diffuse nociception, is weak enough to be kept out of the spotlight of awareness and kept in the preconscious most of the time with various distractions. And here are some of those common distractions. First of all, what's always available is mind wandering, and that's driven by the default mode network. But in parentheses, I always put, what's the excess? So mind wandering can be pleasant daydreaming. And, you could be thinking about a future vacation and stuff. It can be very pleasant and positive. But for some people, it winds up as rumination. You can perform optimally demanding cognitive and motor tasks, games and things, hobbies that people do, but you could wind up addicted in terms of, being a workaholic or being addicted to video games. And then seeking novel stimulation, going sightseeing, things like that, going to new places, very positive. But the extreme, if that's not working for you, the adrenaline junkie comes in, the extreme sports, the really risky stuff. Indulging in pleasurable activities, great way to distract from pain, but it could result in stress eating. It could be overdone. Engaging in social activities, great idea, very positive. But then for some people, it leads to the excessive use of social media, which then has negative consequences. But in addition, I'm talking about two things. One is that distractions sort of displace the diffuse nociception out of consciousness. But there's in my article, there's a lot of neuroscience evidence that all of these activities actually can produce downregulation of pain centers lower down, either through the secretion of endorphins or direct neural inhibition in like the brainstem in some pain areas. So I have that all in the article. So when we're deprived of our distractions, and even if you have the possibility of distractions, sometimes even though your cell phone is available and you could distract yourself, if you're really resenting being stuck in that situation, you might be too upset to engage in those distractions, to really enjoy them, which is unfortunate. But you're now like so focused on resenting the boring situation that it's hard for you to actually engage in distractions that would make you feel better. So anyway, I talked about DN entering consciousness. And the thing is, we tend to be aware of some of the DN, you know, like maybe it's right on the borderline of consciousness. We get little glimpses of it, which is enough to keep us addicted to our distractions. We don't want to go there. We don't want to let that stuff in. And I mean, it's all of the statistics and observations of what's going on in our society support this. I'm just trying to come up with an explanation for this. We know that people are addicted to social media. We know that people, you know, are miserable when they're, you know, and we know how difficult it is for people to meditate, at least initially. So these chronic levels of DN that people walk around with, it's a big, you know, they differ a lot depending on your previous stress reactions, what kind of stress you were subjected to, but also how much you reacted, your resilience, and your coping mechanisms. But supposing you want to know, well, what is my chronic level of diffuse nociception? What kind of background level? Here's a simple exercise for you all to try. Here's what you do. Sit comfortably in a quiet room with your eyes closed and just notice how your body feels. Now, if you start thinking, mind wandering, whatever, stop doing that and return your attention to your body. Set a timer for 15 minutes and just do this and see how you feel, see how you like it. It's going to differ from a lot of people. Some people are going to like it. Some people are going to be miserable. Some people are not going to make it through the 15 minutes. It's like, why am I doing this? Just because Barry said I should try this? But that tells you right away, if you can't make it past about 5 minutes of this, that tells you you have a fairly high level of diffuse nociception. So we always have available the, you know, the thinking thing. And this is where the default mode network comes in. I'm sure it served lots of important and good functions, and that's why it evolved. But apparently, because it does, because activating the DMN actually does downregulate pain, we become addicted to our DMN. We become addicted to thinking, because that's, you know, that's a sign that the DMN, the default mode, is active. So that's why we really can't stop thinking. So the DMN has been just hijacked for pain reduction. It's the easiest thing to do, and it's the hardest thing to stop. It's triggered very automatically because it does reduce pain. That's reinforcement. It's, you know, basic behaviorism. So it's very hard to just stop thinking because it's being generated automatically through that network. And finally, you know, attitudes are critical. So we know that placebos can change your attitude towards pain. If you're thinking, well, pain's going to go away, so I don't have to really worry about it. I got something, you know. Then you, by not worrying about it so much, it goes away. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But to the extent that placebos are mediated by endorphins, you can block the placebo effect with naloxone, just like you can block the effects of heroin. But mindfulness, in some experiments, have been shown to reduce pain in a lab setting, like with the heat stuff on your skin, through direct neural means. It's not blocked by naloxone. It's simply downregulation, inhibitory signals that are inhibiting the activity of let's say, the periaqueductal gray area in the brainstem that does a lot of the pain processing. So the mindful attitude, a feature of most meditation, involves this accepting attitude towards nociception, greater focus on interoception, processing of it. This is the likely reason that long-term meditators have been shown to have an expanded insular cortex with stronger connections to some other brain areas. Some areas of the brain, if you use it more, it does get denser with gray matter, like the hippocampus. They found that, you know, people, the London cab driver experiment, they learned a whole spatial map of London, and their hippocampus got enlarged. And so this greater interoceptive processing has been shown in an experiment to mediate some of the positive benefits of meditation. Finally, so why is all this stress? Why do we have all this stuff? I mean, sure, there's a lot in modern life that can cause stress, but I think it starts really early, like in infancy. You know, we come out too early. We come out of the womb too early. We're not really ready. You know, with kangaroos, the joey comes out and goes into a pouch, which is like, you know, like a neonate ICU, you know, for the developing fetal kangaroo. We come out because our brain is so big and our head is so big that we can't get any bigger. We have to come out. But after we come out, there's a lot more development still going on. So we come out essentially as a quadriplegic. We can't do anything. We can't. You're excited if after a month or two the baby can roll over, can do anything at all. This is completely different from other mammals, where they come out and they're right away doing stuff very soon. So anyway, there's a prolonged period of stress potentially in being totally helpless. Are you going to get all your needs met as a totally helpless infant just by crying? Maybe not. So anyway, but it can start even before birth. Let's say your mom is stressed and she has a lot of stress hormones, a lot of cortisol going on. Well, the placental barrier does not stop it all. So it can come into the fetal bloodstream, and now the fetus has a lot of stress hormones, which can damage its stress system and essentially programming it to have a hyperactive stress system in the future. So this way, stress can be passed down from one generation to the next epigenetically. So it doesn't have to be totally, you know, changing the genes, but actually changing the expression of genes. So it's very important to teach meditation early. And that's my talk. How did I do with time? Not terrible, right? So
Pretty on time.
yeah. So now what? Any questions? Of course, we don't have a lot of participants to ask questions, but let's say, you know, just because you can't think of a question right now, feel free to watch the recording, which will be posted in a few days, and then ask me questions when you've had more time to think about these things that I'm saying. And then also my Psychology of Consciousness article, which is in press right now, I paid for open access, so that'll be linked very soon. I hope to link it to the DUNES webinar page so that everyone can see the article, which gives you all the background and references for what I've been, some of this wild speculation. Not for all of it. There's, you know, for the narrowing and expanding of consciousness, I don't literally have, you know, a lot of neuroscience there, other than the fact that they do show that under psychedelics, the people's brain lights up, so to speak. I mean, they see just you know, lots more neural activity, which so the idea of the expansion of consciousness is sort of a metaphor, but somewhat descriptive, because we really are expanding consciousness in terms of the depth of processing, the amount of associations being generated, and the depth of the feeling of it. It just feels richer and deeper and all that when you have more brain areas active to process things, which is what psychedelics seem to do by changing neurotransmitters. It has a lot to do with the serotonin receptors and all that. So anywho, thank you for listening. And you know, I'm happy to, my email address is just my name, barry.cohen@nyu.edu. So any questions that come up, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you all again in October with Zoran. I'm pretty
It's
sure.
still the third week of October, third Monday.
Yeah, so far that seems to be okay.
Mhm.
But I'll keep you updated, of course. And we have someone locked in for November.
Um, Yeah, so that'll be posted on the website, the November talk also.
So you can,
But
I guess
yeah,
we can stop the recording now, right?
yeah, sure, we can stop recording.
Well, it's perfect. It's 12:59, so.